大家好，欢迎收看今天的全球瞭望，我是郭崇伦。过去10几年当中，亚太国家左右逢源，经济发展上依赖中国大陆，在安全保障上则依赖美国。但是澳洲国立大学的教授怀特却当头棒喝，认为这不可能持续。随着中国大陆崛起跟美国的再平衡，各国现在面临了选边站的困境，必须要在中美之间做出选择，而亚洲恐怕会陷入新的冷战。请看我们的报道。
镁光灯闪个不停。8月12号，澳洲跟美国在雪梨举行年度部长级会议，正式签下为期25年的军事合作协定。美国将在2017年之前派出2500名驻军进驻达尔文海军基地。外界分析认为，美军虽然人数不多，但这份协议将大幅提升澳洲北部的军事设备，不只强化美国在南海的防线，同时也正在落实美国总统奥巴马2011年所提出的亚洲再平衡策略。澳洲战略学者怀特分析，澳洲目前放出的信号就是在追随美国回应大陆崛起，并且倾向于支持美国维持亚洲旧秩序。面对大陆经济跟军事实力不断增强，怀特认为亚洲国家最乐见的就是中美之间能通过协商共享在亚洲之间的权利。不过，这可不是容易的事。
What we've encouraged is constructive military-to-military ties with China, and this type of action is clearly violates the spirit of that.
8月22号，在海南岛附近的国际空域，一架美军巡逻机遭到大陆战机拦截，双方在空中展开交锋。据说距离一度只差7到10公尺，引发美国抗议。中美未来彼此合作，真的有可能实现吗？怀特指出，随着大陆经济崛起，亚洲邻国的矛盾只会越来越大。一方面希望在经济发展上依赖中国大陆，另一方面又希望在安全保障方面依靠美国。不过，这都并非长久之计。怀特认为，亚洲各国最终还是得在美国跟大陆之间做出选择，除非中美真的能透过协商确立新的亚洲安全秩序。而11月 APEC 期间的欧习会将会是各国瞩目的焦点。UDN TV 王方宇编译。
针对今天的主题，我们特别邀请到澳洲国立大学的战略研究教授怀特来跟我们共同讨论。Welcome, Professor White, to our show.
Very nice to be with you. Nice to be with you.
Begin with, I would like you to characterize for us what's the current status of U.S. and China relations, and particularly which direction the relations is heading right now.
Well, I think this is a really critical question because for many years, really since the opening between America and Beijing in 1972, US-China relationship has been basically very stable because China has accepted America as the primary power, the leading power in Asia. And I think what's happening today, what's been happening over the last, say, 5 or 6 years, is that China has ceased to accept American leadership as the basis for Asian affairs and now seeks a bigger role for itself. So the key underlying dynamic in US-China relations is a difference between what China wants, that is a challenge, a new model of great power relations, as President Xi Jinping calls it, on the one hand, and what America wants, which is to preserve the old relationship based on US primacy. So I think the key underlying dynamic in the relationship is escalating rivalry between the US and China as China tries to change the order and win a bigger share of leadership, and the United States tries to resist those changes and preserve its own leadership as the foundation for the Asian order.
So with this rivalry increasing, some people are saying that actually China is bluffing, that China is not really going to confront with the US and its allies. So do you agree that China is bluffing, or can the US pivot to Asia, can really make China back off from this?
Well, I think the idea that China was just bluffing, that China wanted to test America's resolve, but was willing to step back rather than really confront America. I think that's a very common view. I think it's been a very common view in Washington. I think the idea behind President Obama's pivot policy was that if the United States just declared its determination to remain the primary power in Asia, then China would back off and would not continue to press its challenge to American primacy. And I don't think that's right. I think what China has demonstrated in the years since the pivot was announced, since 2011, say, is a willingness to keep pushing, to take quite big risks to confront the United States and US friends and allies in the region in order to try and assert its challenge to US primacy, to demonstrate its own growing power and to diminish US power. So I think it is much more than a bluff.
So if China is not bluffing, then what would the U.S. react to this? I mean, so far we are seeing that maybe U.S. don't have the enough capability of doing it. But 2 years from now, are we seeing a more hawkish new American president coming out from 2016?
Well, I think that's a really key question. I think President Obama has obviously been very keen to try and preserve America's leadership in Asia, but he hasn't, through the pivot, been willing or able to shift the kind of resources that will be necessary to really push back against China's challenge. And even if he had, even if he wasn't preoccupied by concerns in the Middle East, for example, and issues in Eastern Europe, I think it would still be very hard for America to really counterbalance China's challenge. It's not, of course, that China is stronger than the United States viewed overall, but that in Asia, where the challenge is taking place, China can marshal resources which can not defeat the United States, but can prevent the United States defeating China. So it's one of those situations where China, with a relatively little effort, finds it possible to undermine US leadership, even if it can't defeat the United States in a sort of head-to-head battle.
So, so you are suggesting that this kind of the big conflict that is ahead of us is going to be inevitable, or there's some way we can try to avoid that?
I don't believe it's inevitable. I think it's a serious risk. I think the fact that the US wants to preserve primacy in Asia, China wants to undermine US primacy in Asia and take a bigger role itself, that does constitute a very deep driver of escalating rivalry between them. But I don't think it's inevitable that that leads to a sustained Cold War or even a conflict, because I think it's quite possible for both the US and China to make decisions, to make choices, which avoids that. The US, I think, won't be able to impose its primacy on Asia in the face of China's challenge. China won't be able to exclude the United States from Asia. America's too strong for that. So I think there's a possibility that both the US and China could negotiate a new relationship with one another, neither US primacy nor Chinese primacy, but some kind of sharing of power between them, which would provide the basis for a long-term, stable, sustainable relationship. Now, that would be very difficult. I think it would be a very difficult thing for both the US and China to do, but the advantages for both of them would be very great. And the difficulties for both of them, if they fail to negotiate that kind of understanding, would be very great too. They would both find themselves drawn into escalating strategic competition with a very powerful adversary, which neither side could win. So I think there's a chance that with good leadership on both sides, both in China and in the United States, it's possible for them to negotiate a new order, but they haven't started doing it yet. And I think it's important that opportunities be found for both the US and China to start talking to one another about the idea of a new power-sharing arrangement in Asia.
The devil is in the detail. I mean, what exactly would be this kind of arrangement? I mean, every country is going to be affected by this kind of arrangement. What's you have in mind?
Well, it's you're absolutely right. How this would actually work in practice is very critical and very difficult to say. But there are a few principles we can agree on. The first is that both sides would have to accept some fundamental principles. For example, the non-use of force in international disputes. That would have to be a really fundamental principle which both sides would have to agree to accept. I think there might also be some broader principles that they'd have to respect. For example, both would have to be willing to treat the other as an equal and not try and exclude one another. So the United States would have to repudiate the idea of asserting its leadership over Asia, but China would have to accept that America would continue to play a strong role in the region. And for both of them, that would be a very big compromise. It would be a big thing for China, I think, to accept that America will continue to play a big role in Asia, but it would be a big thing for China to, for the United States to deal with China as an equal. Both of those would be very difficult for both sides to achieve. And the third thing, because they'd have to work out how to deal with the rest of us. The smaller and middle countries in Asia, and also the other great powers like Japan and India. So I think there's a lot of different elements that would have to come together.
Do you think that the US is treating Russia more equal than treating with China?
In some ways, yes, it does. Because, for example, the United States does treat Russia as a strategic peer.
Right.
That is, as a country that has, for example, a nuclear capability which is sort of symmetrical with America's. So America can deter Russia, Russia can deter America, and the Americans understand that it's in their interest to preserve that. They don't yet, haven't so far at least, treated China in the same way. They don't quite treat China as a nuclear peer, and I think that's one of the things that China would very much seek from the United States, is the acknowledgement that China's nuclear deterrent capability is a legitimate and indeed important part of a broader, stable regional order.
In your book, you mentioned that China would need a little bit more power space,
Yes.
and China would need a bigger role.
Yes.
But how do you define this
Yes.
kind of new role? I mean, would China is not going to ever satisfy about his new role? Want to expand its power space?
It's a very, very important question. Indeed, there are two issues there. The first is that when we ask ourselves how could the US and China divide power in Asia, so to speak, between them, there are two ways to think about that. One is kind of geographical.
Right.
That is that each of the two powers could take a sphere of influence. That was a little bit like what the US and Soviet Union had during the Cold War, for example. That's a bad model. I think the idea that there's a line down Asia with the Chinese and its sphere of influence on one side and America and its sphere of influence on the other, that's a bad model for Asia's future. I think a much better model is that the two sides agree to exercise jointly a degree of regional leadership over the whole region together.
Right.
And that's a model that we have seen before in history. In Europe, for example, in the 19th century, there was very much, there was a long period, for 100 years really, from 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars all the way through to the beginning of the First World War 100 years ago. There was what was called a concert of Europe, in which all the great powers contributed to a collective security framework, in which they all treated one another as equals. And that was a very important principle. The second point, of course, is that we need to be sure that once the deal is done, once a power sharing arrangement is agreed, that we'd have to make sure that China would be willing to actually abide by it. And I don't think anyone would think it'd be appropriate just to simply take China's word for it, or for that matter, if you were China, to take America's word for it. Both sides would need to have assurance. Now, what underpins the robustness of the understanding of the deal that I think the US and China should try to reach is that both sides would have to define the boundaries of their agreement and say to the other, if you violate our agreement, if you seek a bigger role in the region than we've agreed, if, for example, one side or the other seeks to assert primacy, seeks to assert leadership over the whole region, then the other side would push back militarily. And so both sides have to preserve and be willing to exercise the military capability to defend the new order, the power sharing agreement, if the other tried to violate it.
Your model, it seems, put in words, it would be something like a G2, that they are going to co-manage the whole situation. They're going to join leadership in the whole thing. But somehow the U.S. tried to avoid this kind of mentioning, the G2, or China would like to refer to as new type of great power relations. How do you see that?
It's a very, very important point. I think the first thing to say is that viewed from America's point of view, I think the problem with the G2 idea was that it did carry the implication that it would have to share power with China in this kind of way. And that's not something that Americans, I think, yet by any means accept or embrace. And so I think it hasn't yet received a lot of welcome in the United States. And likewise, China, when China talks about a new model of great power relations, we don't really know what it means. I think as a minimum, it will want the kind of relationship I'm talking about. It will want an equal relationship with the United States. And when we see how China describes their new model of great power relations, they talk about mutual respect and equality as an important element of it. But I also think there's a kind of a bigger question as to whether China actually doesn't want more than that. I think China would prefer to lead Asia, and it hopes the United States will be willing to step back, just as America would prefer to lead Asia and hopes China is willing to step back. So neither side is prepared to put the G2 idea on the table at this stage, because they both hope they can achieve more if the other's willing to settle for less. The other part, of course, is that the problem with the G2 is you ask what happens to everybody else.
Right.
and this is a very important question. I think there's two parts to that too. On the one hand, there are other great powers in Asia. I think in particular Japan and India eventually are both so big and important to the region that they too have to be part of this kind of power sharing arrangement. So I think it's not in the end a G2 but more like a G4 with the US, China, Japan and India all sitting around a big table and managing the region together as equals. Now, of course, the other question is what about the rest of us, the smaller and middle powers? And I think we do face a difficult choice because for all of us, the idea of these four great powers managing the region between them is worrying for the rest of us because we fear that our interests will be compromised as they do deals amongst themselves. On the other hand, we also have to ask how are our interests served if they don't have an agreement? If instead of them getting around a table and doing deals, they compete with one another, which is the escalating rivalry with one another, that would be a very bad outcome too, and worse, I think, for us. So I think the key challenge for small and middle powers is to see how we can encourage the great powers to reach an agreement of the kind I'm talking about, a kind of power sharing arrangement, but also maximise our own influence over them, and that's a great diplomatic challenge for the rest of us.
The coming APEC summit, that is, after that, there's going to be a one-on-one summit between President Obama and President Xi Jinping.
Yes.
Do you think that is a chance to have this kind of concept of Asia forming?
Well, it would be. I would be very glad if it was, but I don't think either side is really yet ready to take that step. I think for both of them, both in Washington and in Beijing, I think they both still believe that the other side is bluffing. So I think in Beijing, I think they believe that President Obama is a relatively weak president, that he's very preoccupied in other parts of the world, that when pushed, if America faces a choice between confronting China militarily or stepping back from Asia, stepping back from its alliance with Japan, stepping back from its responsibilities to the Philippines and so on, then I think the Chinese hope that the United States will choose to step back rather than confront China. And likewise, I think America believes that if a confrontation looms, China will step back. And because they both expect the other to step back, neither of them wants to step back themselves from their own position. And I don't think either of them have really resolved that. In fact, when you look at the way the summit between the two of them in Sunnylands in California last year took place, I do think, although it was obviously welcome that the two leaders had that long period together, I don't think it was very successful in bridging the gap between them. I think in the end they both came away with the same differences that they'd started. For example, you know, President Obama, when he opened the conference, he had a list of things. He said, we need to deal with this and this and this and the specific questions. And he didn't want to talk about the broader structure of the relationship. Whereas Xi Jinping, when he introduced his opening statement at the conference, he didn't talk about those specifics. He talked about a new model of great power relations. So he wanted to redesign the whole relationship on a new basis and then deal with the problems. President Obama wanted to deal with the problems and then maybe talk about a new model of the relationship later. And I don't think that's yet been bridged. So I think, although it's always good to see the leaders talking, and I do hope that they have a follow-up summit after the APEC meeting this year, I think we would be unwise to expect that either side is yet really ready to sit down and start doing a real deal about the nature of the long-term nature of their relationship.
We're going to take a short break. 等一下回来，我们要继续来谈，在这个中美之间的其他各国在亚太国家要怎么样来自处。我们等一下回来。